We'll now look at the background of the story of Mark's Gospel. Basically, the story of Mark's Gospel is that Mark, more than likely, was written prior to the destruction of the Jerusalem temple, which happened in AD 70. Most scholars believe that this is the case because they think that Mark's Gospel doesn't show an indication of the type of tension that arose within Christianity between Jewish Christians and non-Christian Jews that was characteristic after AD 70. We do see this tension in John's Gospel. We see this tension in Matthew's Gospel, but we don't see it in Mark. And plus, Mark's allusions to the destruction of the Jerusalem temple is quite timid. And so scholars oftentimes think that if Mark was aware that the temple had been destroyed, that we would have more hints or details about that destruction. And since we do not, the assumption is that it was written prior to that. Now, there's also another reason why more conservative scholars would think that Mark's Gospel was written prior to AD 70 is because there is a tradition, church tradition, that Mark's Gospel is basically the sermon that had been preached by Peter. In other words, that Mark has written down the stories and teachings that Peter would have said or would have communicated. And since Peter, according to church tradition, dies in the 60s, some think that Mark may have written this gospel immediately after Peter's death. So upon Peter's death, he writes this gospel, and so that's why they might as well think it happened in the 60s. We don't know very much about the author himself. Of course, in the original, there is no title, Gospel of Mark, that it was ascribed to this gospel sometime in the 2nd century. Again, church tradition indicated that this gospel came from this individual. Now, there's good likelihood that that tradition is credible because it seems unlikely that Christians would have ascribed a gospel to a non-apostle. Since Mark is not an apostle, we would have expect or might expect that the tendency would be to ascribe a gospel to someone who was an apostle. So, like in the case with Matthew, in the case with John, one can understand why they would want a gospel ascribed to an apostle, because they would want the gospel to have credibility or to have authority. But it seems unlikely that they would ascribe it to someone who wasn't an apostle. And so that makes it seem more likely that it was this Mark. Now, the most likely candidate for Mark, and the candidate that is identified in the tradition, is that this Mark is the same John Mark who we find in the book of Acts, and who is referenced as well in Paul's letters. This John Mark was a native of Jerusalem, and he is writing in this gospel to Gentile Christians, most likely in Rome. And the reason why we think it's in Rome is because Mark's gospel contains some Latinisms. That is, Mark's gospel is written in Greek, but there are certain words that occur in the gospel that seems to be a Greek form of a Latin term. And so Mark's gospel seems to be more aware of Latin phrases or Latin words than the other gospels. Also, since church tradition identifies Peter as having gone to Rome, and that Mark was with Peter when Peter was martyred, Again, this seems to suggest that it may have been for a Roman audience that Mark had written. Of course, this is all quite theoretical, and there are some who have argued that Mark does not have any specific community in mind, and that he wants to write just for all Christians. But more likely, Mark does have a particular community in mind that he hopes that this gospel will first go to. What Mark wants to do is he wants to urge Christians to follow Jesus Christ with courageous faith. And so there's several things that come up in Mark's gospel that indicates taking up one's cross and following Jesus. Mark's gospel oftentimes as well will have a display between faith and fear, and that those who have fear don't have faith. And so the encouragement is to act with faith and not with fear. Mark's gospel even has an unusual ending, at least the original ending of Mark's gospel ends in Mark 16, verse 8, with the women finding out about the empty tomb and being told that Jesus has risen, but not saying anything to anyone because they were afraid. Now, later on, then, Scribe added a longer addition to Mark's gospel because that was not considered an adequate enough ending. But if we could just consider that ending on its own, the original one, then it looks like Mark really does want to chastise people who act in fear and don't speak. And so what he wants people, followers of Jesus, is to be courageous with their faith, even to the point of even to the point of death. If Mark's gospel had been written after Peter's martyrdom, there may be other Christians who have been martyred, although there was not a empire-wide persecution. There may have been some severe persecution within Rome, and so now Christians are being killed by the Romans, and Mark may want to have written this in order to encourage Christians to be faithful, to be courageous, to be committed, not to be fearful, but to recognize that God has appointed Jesus as the Messiah and that God is bringing his kingdom through Jesus. So according to the tradition, the source of Mark's information about Jesus' life comes from Peter. And this tradition comes to us from a individual named Papias. And Papias was the bishop of Hierapolis, which is in Phrygia, which is in today modern-day Turkey, so on the southern part of Turkey. And Papias, according to lives in the 2nd century. So the point here that's making is our knowledge about this gospel and about who wrote it and where he got his information from. This is coming from supposedly a person who lived in the 2nd century. But that information is actually contained in information that dates to the 4th century. So in other words, someone in the 4th century, someone like Eusebius, tells us a story about a person who lived in the 2nd century named Papias, and Papias said that this was coming from Mark. So whenever we think about the history of this gospel, just keep in mind that our knowledge about its background comes from a 4th century source. And so we have to be somewhat tentative, because it could be that Eusebius has made a mistake or that the tradition has been a mistake. But there's, good reason to believe that Eusebius has reliable information, reliable source about Papias, and that Papias was known by others to tell this information, that Mark got his story, his gospel, from Peter. But it also could be that there was in circulation already stories and sayings about Jesus in the early Christian community. and that it may be that Mark might have gotten some things from Peter, and it may be that Mark got other information from other sources as he constructed this life. And so that'll stop us here for a little bit of the background to Mark's Gospel.